Now let's take a quick look at the various types of scenarios. I have segregated this based on the purpose. And this is a resource that I've shared the link here. It's a very useful resource. So basically, you can call scenarios exploratory in the sense that they encourage you to explore what might happen. So, a hypothetical situation where you are able to see possibilities. And the second type is the normative one, where, how do you reach, given a scenario, what do you have to do to reach a well defined specific outcome? And the third is predictive scenarios in the sense what is sure to happen, what will happen. So this is more concrete than what might happen, which actually allows the learner to explore. So we'll go through each of these types in a very shortly. So here's an example of an exploratory scenario or what might happen. So this is an example from one of our courses. What do you think would might happen if we don't limit warming caused by climate change? And then there are these various options. So when do we use exploratory scenarios? So as I just mentioned, when it's important to make the learner think of many possibilities and you want them to think through each. So your teaching feedback can be given for each option. So instead of just telling the learner that something is right or wrong, you don't even tell them whether their selected option is the correct choice or not, but just give the implications. Now, this is more likely to stick in the learner's mind than to be just told that something is right or wrong. And for those who selected the best option, it is still a good way to help them explore the other implications. What would happen if they selected something else? So, this works very well for exploratory kind of training, as this example just showed. So, the next type is the normative scenario type, where there is a clearly defined outcome. And it is important for you to let the learner know that, there is just one correct step, one correct choice, which will lead them to that defined outcome. So the outcome is a certain result. So this is something where, it works very well for areas of training where the learner needs to synthesize some information and put it together to reach that outcome. So, for instance, if you have some change management initiative going on at work and there is a defined outcome you're looking at, you could provide various options to introduce this new paradigm at work. So here's an example, a very simple example that we use from one of our courses. What should this person do to reach that particular outcome? Now, the third type of scenarios are the predictive scenarios, which, as I mentioned earlier, are what will happen. So this is important when you want to drive home the point to the learner that something is going to be definite, if they select a given choice. So basically, as the name suggests, predictive scenarios work well in predicting the long-term situation, the long-term effects in a given situation. For example, you could use predictive scenarios in your sales training to demonstrate how failure to be consultative with a customer can actually put off the customer and not result in repeat business. So you can present a couple of options on what do you think is the best thing you should do at this point. The customer is in this frame of mind, and here you have a winning solution. So what should you do now? So this works very well in that kind of actually sort of behavioral training, the softer skills that need to be taught. Again, on the screen, you see an example from one of our courses where what do you think this person did? So there's an entire story built up, a short story, and the learner is asked, what do you think this person did next? And there are a couple of very believable options. All of them could equally well be right. And then the feedback goes on to tell them why, one of them is really the best option. So that was something based on the purpose of using the scenarios. Now, I want to just spend a few minutes on talking about the types of scenarios based on their complexity. I think all of us are familiar with simple scenarios where you give a situation, you give the learner a question, and you ask the learner to select an option. So, those are the simple one page non branching scenarios. Again, these can be very effective. Uh, they can be far more effective than just presenting the content and asking the learner to go through it. The other type is the branching scenarios, which can be slightly tricky, but which are well worth the effort, because these are things that these kind of scenarios really make the learning very sticky. And we'll see where branching scenarios work best and where non branching scenarios can do the job equally well. So let's first look at the non branching scenarios. So when should we use them? So when it is not really important to demonstrate the implications of each of the learner's possible actions, then we can use a simple non-branching scenario where we let the learner think through and select the correct answer. So typically we use these non-branching scenarios when there is only one right answer. So as I just mentioned, compliance training is a good fit for non-branching scenarios where a learner has to take the right decision, and anything apart from the right decision results in non-compliance. So it's pretty straightforward, and the implications are fairly obvious. So here is a sample non-branching scenario. It's a course on information security, and there is an employee who's left his workstation unattended and then goes on. And as you can see, once the learner selects their option, the feedback gives them a lot of more information about the situation and why their choice was correct. And likewise for the incorrect choices. Now let's look at branching scenarios. So when should we be using them? So when do we use branching scenarios? So the ideal use case is where it is important to let the learners face the consequences of their decisions. So you present a scenario, you give them three or four possible options, and then instead of just telling them what is the right, best response and what is not a good response, let them play out. You let their choices play out to at least the next two levels. So as they proceed down their choice, they're locked into that particular learning path. And they explore what are the further consequences, what are the further decisions that they would need to take. Maybe there's a way for them to, if they selected a wrong option, maybe there is a way for them to fix it. So typically, branching scenarios are used when more than one correct response is possible, but there is the ideal choice to be made. So an example is that of leadership training with good, better, and the best possible choices that the learner can make in that given scenario. So here's a very simple example of a branching scenario, which I actually took from the Articulate blog, which is incidentally a very good resource for anybody wanting to explore anything to do with learning design, actually. So here's a situation where you're a new employee and you need to get started. What should you do? So there are two options for the learner. You ask your manager or you ask somebody else. Now, option A tells you what happens if you go down that path. So you select ask your manager, and then what is the response? And then option B, of course, then goes on to tell you what would happen if you went with that flow. So this is just a very simple illustration of a branching scenario.